Welcome back. Welcome back to the morning show here on Tobago Updates Television. And thank you so much for staying with us. We continue conversations this morning in studio. And with me, I have Mr. Keiron McDougal, and he is the director of Chem Advisory Services Solutions. And we know him. I mean, I find that the bio is a little bit humble and modest. He has been around for a very long time in terms of events, protocol. So he's a guy who comes from an informed place. Good morning, Mr. McDougal, and welcome.
Good morning, Adanna, and it's absolutely a pleasure to be here again in studio.
Of course, and we had conversations a couple of months ago as it relates to protocol, government protocol in here in Trinidad and Tobago and the way things are done with a specific issue. I think it was the opening of the new airport here in Tobago. And now here we are again with another local issue that we just want to bring some clarity to. And I want to start off with, just giving some knowledge in terms of the operations of the T.H.A. as it relates to secretaries, whether it is they are proceeding on vacation leave, whether they are being transferred to another division, the rights of the Tobago House of Assembly, the administration, the chief secretary, and how we can, whether it is reshuffle, reassign, relocate, persons proceeding on leave. What are some of the things we need to know about those specific things?
All right, so based on what you've asked in terms of the governance of Tobago and by extension the Tobago House of Assembly, is when one looks at the institution Tobago House of Assembly, there are two arms, the legislative and the administrative. Of course, the chief secretary heads the legislative arm of the assembly, whereas we have the chief administrator, who is the most senior public servant that would oversee the administrative arm of the Tobago House of Assembly. Now, the chief secretary is the most senior politician on island that has that jurisdiction in terms of establishing the governance structure in accordance with the Tobago House of Assembly Act as it relates to appointments, assignment, revocation of appointments, delegation of duties, etc., in accordance with the law. Now, the Tobago House of Assembly also has what is called the Executive Council, which comprise of secretaries. And in order for one to be a secretary, that person has to be appointed and take an oath of office in order to operate and fulfill in that role. Of course, the person that gives the directive for such persons to occupy such office is the chief secretary, because he's the person that configures what the executive council, should look like. So the executive council is comprised of secretaries, and that would also include the deputy chief secretary and the chief secretary, of course, who heads the executive council, similar to what a cabinet would look like.
So that's the construct of the Tobago House of Assembly in terms of the secretaries. And so the chief secretary being the most senior officer and the person with responsibility for ensuring that there is some sort of structure and that all the mandates are carried out division by division, ensuring projects and all the things that is necessary for the governance of Tobago are provided. And if they are not provided, then he has to seek them to ensure that we have what we need in our local space, which also includes, as you mentioned, reassigning officers, secretaries to different divisions, making changes where changes need to be, and also accommodating. I'm going now to our main point, accommodating whether it is vacation leave, absence from office, and ensuring that the office is occupied by a capable appointee, a secretary operating in the office. In our open spaces now, as we are aware, Mr. McDougal, people air their opinions, because at the end of the day, we are the persons that you are governing, and we feel, when I say we, the general public of Tobago, and the public believes that you were appointed because of us, the people. And so, of course, when people don't have information, then they are left to speculate on what is happening. So let's speak on the absence of the Secretary of Tourism and the appointment of a new secretary in that space. We saw when the communication came out, and let's talk about that because that is very important. When the communication came out, all we saw is that a new secretary has been assigned to the division, and we're speaking about the division of tourism here in case you're following the conversation. A new secretary is assigned, holding on to her original assignment and carrying these two. And now the secretary for tourism is absent. That is where the conversation is focused on now, because we are aware people can go on vacation leave. People can, but there was nothing leading up to it. It was just like well, she's no longer here and this person is here. And so people are wondering, where did she go? So let's start there. Was that done in accordance to the protocol or the way that it should have been done in terms of how you manage the Tobago House of Assembly?
Well, in the context of the management of the Tobago House of Assembly, I mean, ultimately, the Chief Secretary is the person that is ultimately responsible for the Tobago House of Assembly in terms of how it's governed and operate. What you find happening with the secretaries, the Chief Secretary now, he's the person that delegates those responsibilities to the secretaries, and hence they are appointed to assist him in terms of being, accountable and able to deliver on the mandate and the projects to which, what would have been sold to the population. Now, in terms of communication, I believe that we are having some communication issues in relation to the information that is being disseminated in the public space, leaving, a lot of open room for questions, speculations, etc. Now, you made mention of whether secretaries are eligible for vacation leave, etc. And yes, they are by right entitled, to their vacation, just like any person employed in any other establishment. However, what you find happening in organizations, depending on the exigencies of the service or the role and responsibility of that individual, in some organizations, they may make what is called perhaps departmental arrangements. So there's context of job enlargement where you may have existing employees and you would probably ask them to discharge some additional responsibilities, or perhaps you can find a replacement while that person is absent. Now, in the context of the absence of the Secretary of Tourism, there wasn't really any indication as to what type of leave or what was the nature of absence, because we know from time to time the role and the function of secretary is one that requires the secretary or whoever is in that portfolio to be out of jurisdiction, ever so often, because it entails international marketing of the destination. And there hasn't really been any sort of announcement in terms of whenever the secretary is out of jurisdiction, that a secretary is appointed. But usually what happens in the context of all secretaries, the chief secretary, once a secretary is out of office, the chief secretary has that power to oversee the roles and responsibility of that function. Now, we understand and know that from time to time, the chief secretary may have a hectic schedule and may not necessarily personally be able to take on the role and responsibility of that particular division. And so a secretary might be given that additional responsibility. We saw in the context where the Secretary of Finance, was out of office on assembly business, of course, and a secretary was appointed to oversee the roles and functions of that division. And because of the critical nature of that divisions, where warrants and, ensuring that, releases of funds and so on take place, you want to ensure that adequate coverage, is there. Now, the chief secretary, as I said before, has that ultimate responsibility to assign roles and portfolios to secretaries. But I think what perhaps became apparent and confusing for the public is that nothing was said with respect to the substantive secretary in terms of what was the nature or reason for giving another secretary that added role to oversee the division. And perhaps maybe the communication was clear at that juncture. It may have eased some of the tension that may have occurred in the public domain.
And that is exactly the answer to the confusion, if I could use that word, that is happening now. Because as you mentioned, you made a reference to the Secretary of Finance being out of the country on assembly business. We were aware of that. The public was aware that the Secretary will be out of the country on official T.H.A. business. And of course, a secretary had to be assigned to the division. In this instance, the communication does not tell us anything like that. It just says that the Secretary of Education will now be, operating as the Secretary of Tourism in addition to her substantive role. And that's all the information the public has. And you're quite right. And especially as a communication specialist myself, I see the loopholes in the communication. And one of the main things that can quell confusion is information. So tell us how, in your humble opinion, how do you think this could have been managed a little bit better to ensure that it's not absolutely necessary to give all the information, but what type of information should have been given to the general public?
Well, I mean, ultimately, if a secretary is out of office, whether it's on vacation, on official business, perhaps maybe on sick leave, whatever it is, I believe because of the nature of the office, the public is aware. At the end of the day, the public is really the employers of, our assemblymen and councillors, etc., notwithstanding, at the end of the day, they can manage what information is told to the employer and so forth. But at the end of it all, the communication is where. And that in itself, because the public was not aware of what became of the substantive secretary and another secretary, but it was clear that this secretary that was assigned the additional responsibilities, the word temporarily did suggest that it would not have been for any substantive period of time, extended period of time. But again, the question is what happened? I mean, persons are concerned. I mean, there are a number of things that are in the public domain as it relates to this, that specific division, as it relates to the upcoming Blue Food Festival, the Tobago Carnival, whether the timing was right. I mean, I have been, worked in both public and private sectors, and sometimes, yes, as much as you may want your vacation leave at a specific time, the employer makes that determination whether or not is this the appropriate time for you to proceed and leave owing to the exigencies of the service. But notwithstanding that, the Chief Secretary, in his wisdom, I'm certain, would have ensured that, the necessary coverage would be put in place. Because sometime at the end of the day, we all work hard, and sometime being denied maybe a little time off could create further problems. So sometimes you may not want to deny, and no one knows what was the extent of the leave of absence, because at the end of it all, the role and function of that office need to be carried out. Now, there were also, questions in the public space that the division had an assistant secretary, and why not elevate that person, to that role? But unfortunately, assistant secretaries do not have the powers to discharge the duty of secretary. In order for that to happen, the assistant secretary role has to be revoked, and then they now have to be appointed, take their oath of office to carry out that role. Assistant secretaries are not necessarily part of the executive council. They really cannot make decision. As a matter of fact, they report to the secretary, and the secretary at the end of the day has that ultimate responsibility and accountability, not just to the Chief Secretary, but Tobago on a whole as it relates to the functioning of that specific division. Now, while ideally, because you may have a sitting assistant secretary in that division who may be on Kara with maybe the operation. Some of them, unfortunately, do not know what is even happening in their division, because they might just be given a small area of responsibility to focus on. So ultimately, they may not be aware of what is happening overall, because at the end of the day, as I said, the secretary, so even if you may have responsibility, let's say, for antiquities as the assistant secretary, at the end of the day, the secretary, when the media call, you're not calling the assistant secretary, you're calling the secretary. So the secretary also need to be aware of what is happening in that department, even if some level of autonomy is given to the assistant secretary, but ultimately an assistant secretary cannot. But a secretary, because that person has been already
oath,
appointed
right.
at that level, the chief secretary definitely can assign additional, responsibilities, to that person. So the question basically was, and yes, you can actually have two persons operating in a similar role. So whereas we have the substantive secretary, maybe the communication provided more details. Okay, so the secretary, let's say perhaps on vacation, and then we have a secretary now temporarily thing. So we know that this secretary is performing the duties of tourism, etc., while so-and-so is on vacation leave. I think that information is what would have helped to quell, some of the confusion that has happened in this space.
Mr. McDougal, you really broke it down there and brought home the information, because that was leading to my next question. A lot of people talking about why the assistant secretary, but you really brought clarity there in terms of people don't realize that everything is a system. There's a system, there are procedures that you have to take. Now mentioning, I didn't even think about revoking the assistant secretary position. I was only thinking about now taking the oath for secretary. So now you have to revoke this, then take the oath, then, and so it would take too long to get all these things done. And then when he has to go, when the secretary comes back now, then he has to be revoked. As how can you revoke the secretary and revert back to being assistant secretary? So I see there the confusion that could have caused. But again, if the information was given, then the people of Tobago would not have had the issues in terms of formulating in their own mind, well, why didn't we do this? We could have do this, and where's she gone, and all of these things. Just having the information, which is absolutely necessary. And in closing, I'd like for you to share any other information you think our viewers should know here in our Tobago space in terms of the operations of the Tobago House of Assembly.
All right. The Tobago House of Assembly now is really a unique and, dynamic organization. And it is unfortunate, sad that, persons do not take time out to understand how the institution operates. And even when persons in your own community, in your own space, assume office of leadership, the level of, disrespect that, continues, and persons don't seem to know where to draw the line. Of course, there are particular ways of how you address our leaders, so chief secretary, of course, you don't address him, just by his first name, secretaries. Of course, there's that distinction. At what point do you address somebody as assemblyman? The confusion as well in terms of the space. Why not assemblywoman as opposed to assemblyman? But those things are what forms part of the law, the act, and, those things, have to be carried out. One of the things that we as a people need to understand, in order for us to know, you have to ask questions. And sometimes asking question is not necessarily creating mischief, but I believe that maybe perhaps a program educating the public on, the operations. I know the Assembly legislature has attempted to, initiate programs even at the level of the primary school to bring them more aware. But our senior folks, our more mature individuals, our young adults, persons are not really aware of what is happening. And then when persons add their 2 cents, it creates confusion. So you really don't know what is right, what is wrong, whether this is appropriate, and so on. And, my whole take on everything is that what we really need to see happening from our leaders is greater transparency, adequate communication in the public space. And I think that is what builds and would drive confidence at the end of the day. Now, I am not saying, because while, yes, there has been, that whole trend of precedents where when a secretary perhaps embarks on an international mission and they come back and they report via a post-executive media briefing, we have seen where some of these things are not happening. Sometimes the press release that you get is after the fact. Right, so they're already gone, and there isn't any opportunity to get more information as to whether this decision was, in the best interests and so on. And then sometimes it is even further disappointing that the information only comes to you via third-party sources. So whereas if it is that the chief secretary is in Canada, for example, promoting our Carnival and Tobago, maybe the best place for that information to be shared with the public should have been through his communication department, rather than somebody you see there sharing it on a Facebook post. And that in itself, creates a lot of problems in the society. It breaks down trust. It creates a lot of back and forth because, of course, the chief secretary, his supporters, you have the opposition. So a lot of rivalry happening there. And because we are soon approaching what I would consider the silly season, of course, we'll see more of these issues happening in the public space. But no matter what, in any organization, communication is key. You don't necessarily have to give all the information, but at least give the public, some information. If you're working in an organization and your boss is going on leave, whether you don't have to specify whether if it's maternity or whatever, you'll be absent from duty so time, and during that period, this person would be covering, so we expect you to extend the courtesies to the person that is holding on until such time. I think that in itself builds the rapport, the relationship, the trust in organization, and all we are asking, whoever is there, to respect the employers as well, the population, people are looking on. Person may not necessarily voice their opinion, but at the end of the day, we do not look good, especially when you're on the outside. As a matter of fact, when the whole confusion and all the bacchanal, has been happening, I was actually out of the country, and when you're out and you're looking in, you're saying to yourself, my God, what is going on? What is really going on? You're ashamed because here on one hand, you're telling people about your beautiful island, Tobago, with this, that, and then at the end of it all, I think, unfortunately, even around that period of time, there were so many things happening in this space, whether it was accident, persons, the crime and all of that. So it's just unfortunate, but at the end of the day, I believe more persons just need to hold our leaders a bit more accountable, ask the appropriate questions, and at the end of the day, I think the status quo has to change.
Thank you so much, Mr. McDougal, for, that's really intense dive into the operations of the Tobago House of Assembly, at least how it was set up, the legislative arm and the administrative arm, and for us having an understanding. People, I want to advise you to read, get the knowledge, get the education, know what you need to know so that you can ask questions from an informed place. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have been speaking with Mr. Keiron McDougal, and he's the director of Chem Advisory Services Solutions. If you need information, you can contact him, or you can check any of the websites that direct you to the Tobago House of Assembly Act. I am Adanna Combie, and this is where we have to end the morning show here on Tobago Updates Television. But it's not where we end our programming. We head on over to GMT, which is Good Morning Tobago. So do stay with us, and as you do, we invite you to help us. Share the live, share the live, share the live.